Section 1. The winepress and the locusts. The dust in the air is suffocating, settling thickly over the damp stone. Most readers instantly recognize his name. It is the ultimate biblical underdog narrative. We are traditionally taught to read the story of Gideon. God's strength actually requires his inadequacy. Gideon turns and runs back up the hill to his 300 men. He wakes them in the dark. "Arise," he says, "for the Lord has given the host of Midian into your hand." But as he begins to organize his tiny force for the midnight assault, he does not distribute weapons. What he places into their hands has absolutely no place on a battlefield. It is the middle of the night on the ridge of Mount Gilboa. 300 men are awake, cold, and waiting for their commander to distribute the weapons. They know they are moving against an encampment of 135,000 armed raiders. But when Gideon finally approaches his men, he does not hand them iron. He does not hand them shields. Instead, he divides his fragile army into 3 companies and places 3 distinct items into their hands: a trumpet, an empty clay pitcher, and a torch. To the modern reader, this sounds like a clever tactical trick. But to the ancient Israelite, this loadout is deeply shocking. If you look closely at the cultural meaning of these objects, the entire nature of the battle changes. The first item is the trumpet, or the shofar, made from a hollowed-out ram's horn. The shofar was occasionally used by commanders to signal troop movements. As a classic military triumph, the tale of a reluctant hero who eventually gathers an elite, highly disciplined squad of 300 warriors. But its primary use in ancient Israel was entirely different. The shofar was an instrument of announcement. It was blown by priests to declare the Jubilee, to gather the assembly for worship, or to signal the terrifying, mountain-shaking presence of God, just as it did at Sinai and the walls of Jericho. The second object is the empty clay jar, the cad. This is perhaps the most bizarre item ever brought into a combat zone. The cad was the most ordinary, unremarkable domestic object in the ancient Near East. It was cheap, highly breakable, and typically used to carry water from the local well or to store grain in a quiet kitchen. It is an object of mundane domestic life, entirely devoid of military value. It represents absolute fragility. The third object is the torch, or the lapid, wrapped in rags, soaked in pitch or oil. These torches were lit and then immediately concealed inside the large clay pitchers. Cut off from a full oxygen supply, they would quietly smolder in the dark, giving off barely a whisper of smoke and no visible light, until the vessel surrounding them was destroyed. This is where the profound reality of God's strategy comes into focus. By putting a trumpet in one hand and a large clay pitcher in the other, Gideon has rendered his men completely defenseless to pull off a tactical masterstroke against an overwhelming empire. It is frequently preached as a motivational story about extraordinary human courage. A soldier cannot hold a heavy jar and a ram's horn while simultaneously holding a sword or a shield. God has systematically stripped them of both offensive capability and defensive protection. This is not a military formation. It is a liturgical procession. God is not preparing his men for physical combat. He is turning the ridge above the valley into a sanctuary. He is commanding them to stand in the dark, holding instruments of worship, domestic frailty, and hidden light. The battle will be won not by their strength, but by their willingness to stand completely vulnerable in the presence of the enemy. Under the cover of darkness, the 300 men descend the mountain. They spread out silently, taking their positions along the ridges that encircle the massive Midianite encampment. They are holding their breath, their hands gripping cold clay and rough bone. They are in position, but a question still hangs in the suffocating night air. They have obeyed the command, but how can unlit torches and empty kitchen pots possibly defeat an army of 135,000 men? The night air is completely still. It is the beginning of the middle watch, shortly after midnight, and calculated strategy. But when you look closely at the ancient text, that familiar interpretation completely falls apart. The Midianite guards have just changed their shifts, and the massive encampment on the valley floor is buried in deep, Vulnerable sleep. Around the perimeter, 300 Israelites stand completely unseen in the pitch black, their hands gripping the strange instruments of their warfare. Then, Gideon gives the signal. In a single, coordinated movement, 300 men raise the clay jars and smash them. The violent crash of earthenware fractures the silence, echoing sharply off the hillsides. Instantly, oxygen rushes over the smoldering pitch of the concealed torches. 300 fires suddenly flare to life in the darkness, creating a blinding, terrifying ring of light around the camp. Then, the men raise the shofars to their lips. 300 rams' horns scream into the night, accompanied by a deafening, unified shout, for the Lord and for Gideon. To understand what happens next, we have to look at the psychology of the ancient battlefield. In the ancient world, a single trumpeter and a single torchbearer would normally lead an entire company of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of men into combat. If a sleeping army suddenly wakes up to the blast of 300 trumpets and the glare of 300 torches surrounding them on every side, their minds immediately perform a terrifying calculation. They do not assume they are surrounded by 300 men holding pots. The hero of this story is not brave. He is paralyzed by fear and doubt, from the first chapter to the last. They assume they are surrounded by an invading force of tens of thousands. The Midianites wake to an absolute nightmare. The noise is deafening. The darkness is suddenly pierced by fire. And the perimeter of their camp is roaring with the sound of the Israelite advance. Panic is a contagion. In the pitch black of a crowded, disoriented camp, it moves faster than a plague. The text captures the ensuing chaos in one devastating sentence. The Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. The Midianites do not know who is friend and who is foe. Terrified men swing wildly at shadows. They stumble over tents, livestock, and each other. The vast numerical superiority that made them invincible only hours earlier now becomes their greatest liability. Because they are so large and so tightly packed together in the dark, they slaughter each other in a blind frenzy. Notice what is happening on the ridge. The 300 Israelites are not charging down the hill. They are not swinging weapons. The text is very specific. Every man stood in his place around the camp. They are quite literally standing still. They are holding their positions, holding the light, and watching as God dismantles an empire without Israel ever having to draw a blade. When the angel of the Lord suddenly appears to Gideon in the winepress and calls him a mighty man of valor, the swords that win the battle of Jezreel belong entirely to the enemy. Israel's profound weakness, combined with their obedience, triggered the enemy's collapse. The Midianite coalition fractures and flees into the night. The decisive victory is secured. The historical event is finished. The valley is cleared. Sadly, Gideon's personal story will eventually end in tragedy as he forgets this lesson and builds a monument to his own success. But the divine pattern established that night remains permanent. God proved that he does not need a massive army, an unbreakable vessel, or a polished sword. He only needs a fractured jar that is willing to let the light shine through. That would already be a profound historical lesson. But the story does not end in the book of Judges. Centuries later, a man sitting in the Roman world picks up this exact same imagery to explain the central mystery of the Christian life. Centuries after the fires died down in the Jezreel Valley, the Apostle Paul sits in a Roman province, dictating a letter to a struggling church in Corinth. He is not writing a military manual. He is writing about the gospel, about human suffering, and about how God chooses to reveal his glory to a dark world. And to explain this mystery, the title feels almost like a tragic irony. And when Gideon finally manages to recruit a massive army to fight the Midianites, Paul reaches past the gleaming iron weapons of the Roman Empire and selects the exact same imagery God handed to a terrified farmer. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 4:7, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us." To understand the depth of Paul's metaphor, we have to look at the Greek text. The phrase translated as jars of clay revolves around the word ostrakinos, derived from ostrakon. In the 1st century, an ostrakon was an earthenware vessel made of baked dirt. The English translation, jars of clay, can sometimes sound artistic to modern ears, bringing to mind a handcrafted vase displayed on a shelf. But in the ancient world, ostrakinos was the absolute opposite of prestige. These were cheap, unglazed, mass-produced containers. They were the disposable packaging of the ancient Near East used for carrying oil, ordinary water, or even waste. They were easily chipped, quickly discarded, and possessed no intrinsic value. If you wanted to protect a priceless treasure, you placed it in a heavy bronze lockbox or a silver chest. You never hid it in baked dirt. But Paul says this is exactly what God has done. He has taken the ultimate treasure, the blazing, eternal light. God does something that defies every logical principle of ancient warfare. He systematically sabotages his own generals' forces of the gospel, the very glory of Jesus Christ, and placed it inside cheap, fragile, entirely unimpressive human vessels. Paul is revealing that Gideon's bizarre battle strategy was never meant to be a one-time historical anomaly. It was a permanent theological blueprint. The way God fought in the Valley of Jezreel is the exact same way God operates in the Christian life. Notice the terrifying logic of the pattern. In the book of Judges, the torches were completely useless as long as the clay jars remained intact. The light was present, but it was suffocated by the thick walls of the container. It was only when the cad, the ordinary earthenware vessel, was violently shattered that the fire could pierce the darkness and rout the enemy. Paul understood that the same mechanism applies to the human soul. He writes a few verses later that he is afflicted in every way, perplexed, persecuted, struck down. He is describing the fracturing of his own life, the suffering, the physical deterioration, the severe anxiety, and the deep emotional trials were the heavy blows breaking his clay. We spend our entire lives trying to prevent our jars from cracking. We want to be seen as iron shields or golden chalices. We want to project an image of unbreakable strength, assuming that God can only use us if we are whole, polished, and perfectly put together. The problem is not that Israel's army is too weak to secure a victory. According to God, the problem is that they are still far too strong. But the theology of clay destroys that assumption. The light cannot be fully seen until the vessel is fractured. The breaking is not a sign that God has abandoned you, nor is it evidence that your faith has failed. The breaking is the exact mechanism that allows the treasure inside you to become visible to the dark world around you. Once this pattern becomes clear, it completely changes how we interpret our own limitations. If this is the blueprint of Scripture, it means God is not frustrated by your weakness. He deliberately chose it. And this is where the historical pattern stops being ancient theology and becomes intensely, painfully personal. We spend our lives trying to assemble our own 32,000 men. We stockpile financial resources, carefully curate our public reputations, and work exhausting hours to build a fortress of competence. We live in a culture that worships visible strength and violently despises vulnerability. If we feel fear, we hide it in the dark, swinging our tools in the claustrophobic dust of our own private wine presses. If we experience failure, chronic anxiety, or physical limitation, we immediately view it as a fatal liability. We are terrified of being exposed as a cheap, worthless barley loaf. The profound exhaustion you feel is often the result of trying to maintain this illusion. This raises a profound question. Why would God intentionally dismantle Gideon's military advantage? Why force a terrified farmer to face an empire? You are trying to convince the world and perhaps God that your clay jar has no cracks. You assume that God needs your strength to secure the victory. You think He is waiting for you to conquer your fear, perfectly organize your life, and become a fearless spiritual warrior before He can effectively use you. But look again at the strange mathematics of the water test. What if the pressure you are currently experiencing is not a sign of God's absence? but the deliberate reduction of your self-reliance? Sometimes, God allows our defensive padding to be stripped away. A career unexpectedly stalls. A trusted relationship fractures. A sudden health crisis removes our independence. Our carefully constructed army of security is suddenly reduced from 32,000 to 300. We are left standing by the water, looking at an overwhelming problem, feeling completely inadequate for the battle ahead. This is where the central contrast of Gideon's story directly confronts us. This is not ultimately a story about finding hidden courage. It is a story about what remains when your external appearances disappear. What are you desperately trying to control? What weakness are you hiding from God? Assuming it disqualifies you from His purpose, God is not waiting for you to become iron. He wants to use your clay. But yielding your strength requires a profound shift in trust. When you look at the overwhelming Midianites in your own life, a man stands at the bottom of a sunken pit, swinging a heavy wooden flail against a small bundle of harvested grain, with tools that are utterly incapable of drawing blood. This is not ultimately a story about human bravery overcoming impossible odds. The frightening medical diagnosis, the financial instability, the deep, disorienting grief. Your instinct is to fight harder, to negotiate for more troops. The hardest spiritual discipline is to stop fighting for control and accept the reality of your own fragility. The biblical response to fear is to name it honestly and place it within the larger truth of the text. Your limitations are not obstacles to God's plan. They are the exact fractures where His light is preparing to break through. You do not have to defeat your terror before you step onto the battlefield. Gideon was still trembling in the dark when he blew the trumpet. You only have to stand on the ridge, hold the light, and yield. When you finally accept this, the crushing burden of having to save yourself simply vanishes. You no longer have to pretend to be unbreakable, but to fully understand the depth of this peace, we have to follow the pattern one step further. There is one final place this imagery appears, and it leads back to the very beginning. Gideon's story is not an isolated incident of military sabotage. It is a foreshadowing of the most subversive event in human history, centuries after the Midianites fled the valley. God did not just send another reluctant judge to deliver His people. He sent His own Son. It is a story about human weakness becoming the exact instrument of God's victory. It is a narrative that replaces iron swords with empty clay jars. And when Jesus arrived, He perfectly embodied the exact symbols of the Jezreel Valley. Christ became the ultimate barley loaf. He was born in poverty, marginalized by the elite, and dismissed as worthless by the religious authorities. He was the bread of life, yet He allowed Himself to be treated like animal feed, despised and rejected by men. More profoundly, the incarnation was God placing His eternal, blazing glory into a fragile vessel of human flesh. Jesus became the ultimate jar of clay. But unlike Gideon's army, who smashed their pitchers to defeat an earthly empire, Jesus allowed His own physical body to be violently shattered by an empire to defeat death itself. On the cross, the ultimate vessel was broken, and in that breaking, the light of the world poured out, completely disrupting the darkness and securing a permanent victory for a people who could never save themselves. When you step back and look at the complete architecture of this narrative, three undeniable truths remain. First, God will constantly strip away the resources we use to build our own pride. Second, He does not require elite warriors. He deliberately selects the unqualified. And third, true victory is never achieved by holding yourself together. It is achieved by yielding, demanding that the people of Israel step onto a battlefield with nothing to protect them but fragile pottery and hidden fire. We began this journey in the suffocating dust of a sunken winepress. We watched a terrified man hiding in the dark, surrounded by an overwhelming threat, convinced that he needed a massive army and iron swords to survive. You may feel like you are standing in that exact same pit today. You are exhausted from trying to manufacture your own strength, desperately trying to hide your fractures from a culture that demands perfection. But the story of Gideon offers a profound, breathtaking relief. You do not have to be an iron shield. You do not have to have the numbers on your side. The valley of your own life may seem impossibly dark, and the forces arrayed against you may feel entirely overwhelming. But God is not asking you to conquer the darkness with your own brilliance. Look again at the ridge above the valley. The massive threat is gone. The silence is profound, and the night is illuminated not by whole, perfect, polished vessels, but by shattered pieces of ordinary clay, resting in the dirt, faithfully holding an eternal flame. Your weakness is not an obstacle to God's plan. It is the exact instrument He is waiting to use. Do not fear the breaking. It is the only way the light gets out. Before a single clay jar can be shattered in the valley, God first has to break Gideon's reliance on numbers. Against all odds, the terrified farmer manages to blow a trumpet and gather 32,000 men. It is a respectable force. It is enough to give a desperate commander a false sense of security. But as they camp at the edge of the valley, looking down at an enemy camp that stretches out into the horizon, God speaks a command that violates every rule of military survival. He is about to send the army home. The mathematics of ancient warfare are brutally simple. Geography can help, and iron weapons can occasionally tip the scales. But survival almost always comes down to numbers. The larger army surrounds, exhausts, and eventually crushes the smaller one. When Gideon looks out from his camp at the spring of Harod, the math is already terrifying. Threshing wheat is a task that belongs on the breezy hilltop, where the wind can easily carry away the useless chaff. Below him in the valley, near the hill of Moreh, the coalition of Midianites, Amalekites, and eastern raiders stretches out like sand on the seashore. Later in the biblical record, we learn this occupying force numbers 135,000 men. Standing behind Gideon are exactly 32,000 Israelite volunteers. They are outnumbered more than 4 to 1. They are untrained, under-equipped, and facing a seasoned, highly mobile raiding force. Every instinct of a commander screams that 32,000 is dangerously insufficient. Gideon needs more men, more time, and more weapons. But this is where God interrupts the mathematics of warfare. The Lord speaks to Gideon, but He does not offer a tactical advantage. He offers a devastating subtraction. God says, "The people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand." It is one of the most counterintuitive statements in all of Scripture. How can 32,000 men be too many to fight 135,000? The answer is found in the second half of the verse. God explains His reasoning. "Lest Israel boast over me, saying, 'My own hand has saved me.'" The text reveals a profound theological reality. God is looking at the impending battle, and He recognizes a threat far more dangerous than the Midianite army. The greater danger is Israel's ego. If they win with 32,000 men, they will convince themselves they fought brilliantly. But this man is hiding inside a hollowed-out winepress. He is swinging his tools in the claustrophobic dark, choking on the dust. They will write songs about their tactical genius. They will attribute the deliverance to their own human strength. And in doing so, they will return to the exact self-reliance that brought the Midianites into their land in the first place. God refuses to share the credit with human pride. So, He instructs Gideon to invoke an ancient military law, written centuries earlier in the book of Deuteronomy. The law of Moses required commanders to stand before their troops prior to a battle and offer an exit. Anyone who was faint-hearted or terrified was ordered to go home, lest his panic spread and melt the courage of his brothers. Gideon stands before his fragile army and makes the announcement, "Whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return and hurry away from Mount Gilead." You have to imagine the crushing silence that follows. Then, the shifting of feet. Then, a mass exodus. 22,000 men turn their backs and walk away. In a single moment, Gideon loses more than 2/3 of his forces. He watches as his neighbors and his primary source of security disappear over the ridge. His army is instantly reduced to 10,000 men. The odds are no longer 4 to 1. They are now nearly 14 to 1. For a commander who was already hiding in a winepress out of terror, this reduction is a psychological catastrophe. He has been stripped of his defensive padding, terrified that a foreign shadow might fall across the rim of the pit. In the Jezreel Valley stretching out above him, a brutal occupation has taken hold. He is left staring at an impossible situation, assuming that this must be the absolute limit of what God would require of him. The remaining 10,000 men are the bravest of the bunch, the ones willing to stand their ground. But the divine sabotage is not finished. God looks at the remaining 10,000 men, standing nervously by the water, and he determines that they are still far too strong. The spring of Harod pools quietly at the base of Mount Gilboa, reflecting the harsh sunlight of the Jezreel Valley. 10,000 men stand on its muddy banks, exhausted, thirsty, and waiting for orders. They are the brave ones, the fraction who refuse to walk away when offered the chance to escape. Gideon must look at them and think this is the hardened core of his resistance. But God speaks again, and the words are devastating. The people are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. The test God designs is strange and seemingly arbitrary. He tells Gideon to watch how the men drink from the spring. He is to separate those who lap the water with their tongues, as a dog laps, from those who kneel down on their knees to drink. This is where one of the most famous misunderstandings in biblical history usually occurs. For generations, this moment has been preached as a test of tactical awareness. The book of Judges describes the Midianites moving across the land like a swarm of locusts. The common interpretation assumes that the 300 men who scooped the water to their mouths with their hands were remaining alert. We are told they were keeping their eyes on the horizon, keeping one hand on their swords, refusing to make themselves vulnerable to an ambush. According to this popular view, God was filtering out the careless soldiers to create an elite, highly disciplined squad of biblical special forces. But if you examine the text carefully, that entire tactical interpretation collapses. The biblical author never praises their military posture. The text never mentions their alertness. It never says they were holding weapons. In fact, dropping to your knees is a standard, efficient way to drink directly from a stream, while trying to lap water from your hand like a dog is awkward, frantic, and hardly the mark of a seasoned warrior. The true reason for God's selection has nothing to do with the physical readiness of the men. It has everything to do with the mathematics of the remaining group. When the drinking is finished, 9,700 men have bowed on their knees. Only 300 have lapped from their hands. God does not choose the 300 because they are the most qualified. He chooses them because they are the absolute minority. If 9,700 men had lapped like dogs, they are devastating nomadic raiders, arriving every harvest season not to conquer cities, but to strip the fields bare. God would have sent them home and kept the 300 who knelt. The water is not a test of elite military readiness. It is a filter for human inadequacy. God is systematically removing every possible advantage. He is stripping the army down to a number so absurdly small that when the victory finally happens, it cannot possibly be attributed to human skill. Gideon watches in silence as another 9,700 men walk away, disappearing into the hills. He is left standing by the water with 300 ordinary, unqualified men. The mathematical odds are now 450 to 1. It is no longer a battle, it is a suicide mission. Gideon is completely paralyzed. His massive army is gone. His remaining men are a fraction of a fraction. And the valley below him is teeming with 135,000 hostile soldiers. But God knows the terror gripping his commander. As night falls over the camp, God does not give Gideon a sword to calm his nerves. Instead, he gives him a command to walk directly into the dark. Night falls over the Jezreel Valley. The text describes the enemy encampment sprawling across the valley floor, their camels as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Gideon is terrified. He is standing on the ridge with a useless remnant of 300 men. But God does not rebuke his fear. They do not just take the crops, they take the livestock, to the resources, and the survival of an entire generation. Instead, God offers a quiet concession. If you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah your servant, and you shall hear what they say." God knows exactly what Gideon needs. He does not need another terrifying angelic visitation. He needs to hear the truth from the mouth of the enemy. Gideon and Purah slip through the darkness, creeping carefully to the very edge of the Midianite encampment. They crouch in the shadows outside a tent, listening to the murmuring voices of the guards on the night watch. One soldier is recounting a strange, unsettling dream to his comrade. In the dream, a single object tumbles down the hill and rolls directly into the Midianite camp. It strikes a massive tent, turning it completely upside down and leaving it flattened in the dirt. But the object is not a massive boulder. It is not a flaming chariot. The guard describes it as a cake of barley bread. To understand the profound insult of this image, we have to look closely at the Hebrew text. The phrase used is tzelil lechem seorim. In basic English, it simply means a baked or roasted barley loaf. The translation is accurate, but the English phrase carries a rustic, almost pleasant tone that completely masks the ancient cultural stigma. In the ancient Near East, wheat was the grain of wealth, prestige, and human consumption. Israel has been reduced to living in caves and mountain clefts. And this is exactly where we first meet Gideon. Barley was the exact opposite. It was primarily grown as animal feed. It was the grain of severe famine, the food of the desperately poor. If a family was reduced to eating barley bread, they were at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. To call a man a barley loaf was not a metaphor for rugged endurance. It was a sneering insult. It meant they were pathetic, worthless scavengers. When the second Midianite guard interprets the dream, he connects the imagery perfectly. He says, "This is no other than the sword of Gideon. God has given Midian and all the camp into his hand." Notice what God is doing here. He is not trying to boost Gideon's fragile self-esteem. He does not send a dream portraying Gideon as a gleaming iron sword or a roaring lion. God uses the enemy to confirm exactly what Gideon already feels. You are nothing but a worthless, hardened piece of animal feed. You are weak. You are poor. You are entirely insufficient. But God is the one rolling the loaf, and he will use the weakest, most unimpressive thing in the valley to crush the impenetrable tent of the Midianite empire. Hearing this, Gideon's posture finally changes. In the dark, crouching at the edge of an enemy camp that could slaughter him in a heartbeat, he bows his head and worships. The paralysis breaks. He finally understands the mathematics of the water test. He understands his own weakness.